I'm Bob at ILikeToMakeStuff, and here I am in my finished kitchen. It's not actually finished because we never put a backsplash up, and for the last year or so, on and off, we've been trying to come up with a good design for the tile to go on this backsplash, and we finally came up with something, but it's a little bit complex. So today, I want to try to figure out some tips and tricks to help you and me put up a complex tile backsplash. Let's give it a shot. So the first thing you gotta do, obviously, is decide on the design. And for my wife and I, that took a lot of back and forth, a lot of research, a lot of Pinteresting, and eventually we ended up with kind of a chevron waterfall thingy, and we ended up sketching it out like this. But this is not good enough to lay out your tile. So the next thing you need to do from here is make it a little bit more exact. One simple way to do that is with graph paper, but an even more flexible way is to go to the computer. Now before you actually start laying it out, you have to decide what the tile is because the size has a lot to do with the layout. And this can be pretty difficult unless you actually know what's available. So the first thing we had to do was go look at what was available at all the big box stores, rule out all the ones that are crazy expensive, and then look at the sizes that we had to choose from. From that, I wanted to see them up close, so I got some scrap plastic, but you could use MDF or cardboard, and cut out some pieces that are exactly the same size as the tiles listed on websites so you can see them in front of you. From there, we chose the size that we wanted. It was a 2x10, and so then we could go to the computer and start laying it out. I decided to use Illustrator for this, but Fusion would work great. You could even use something like Inkscape, which is free. But basically, I took a photo of our kitchen and brought it in behind the thing that I was gonna be working on, and then I scaled it up so that my 36-inch hood was 36 millimeters on the screen. Just an easy one-for-one conversion. With that, I went ahead and drew out some squares that are the size of the tiles and started to lay them out. Now the gaps here are not going to be one for one, although in Fusion you could make that happen programmatically. It'd be pretty awesome. But I got a general idea of how it was going to be laid out here, and then I could also count how many individual tiles I was going to need. With a scaled drawing like this, it's really easy to start getting a good picture of what the whole thing is going to look like, but it's still not going to be one for one. For that, you got to go full scale. I ordered a box of the tile, actually a few boxes of the tile, and it's a good thing we did because a 2x10 tile is not actually 2x10. This thing's almost 1/4 of an inch shorter and about 1/8 of an inch more narrow, and that is going to cause us a little bit of a problem. But the good thing is we can lay this out full scale on a big piece of paper and use the tiles to lay them out so we can figure out the spacing and make it work with the items that are already mounted on the wall. So what we're going to do to lay this out full scale is I got a roll of craft paper. This stuff's really inexpensive. You can get it from any kind of art store or craft store. And I'm going to lay it out on our island. Obviously, if you don't have a surface this big, the floor would work just as well. But I'm using the bottom edge here as the bottom edge of our countertop. So we're going to work up from this point. It's a known place that we can measure from. We've got our paper laid down, and the next thing, this is really important, is to take very exact measurements of all of the fixed things that your tile is going to have to interact with. In my case, that's the hood, the stove, the countertops, the window frames, the light switches, and all of that has to be relative to this bottom edge because that's where our paper is. So I'm going to get those measurements and then draw them on here, and then we can start laying out the tile. I got all those things drawn out on the paper to scale, and one important thing that I marked is the center line for the hood. Because of our design, having that kind of downward V, I want to have that centered line exactly centered within the hood, and so that's kind of where we're going to start. I don't know, though, exactly where that's going to go vertically, and so that's one thing we're going to have to figure out just by laying the tile on this. Another thing we don't know whether we need or not is spacers, because once you start adding spacers in between tiles, that added space is going to compound over the tiles, and it can make a really big difference over just a few feet. So immediately as I started laying this out, I started to see that there's actually a different diagonal created in the tile than what I was planning on. So I'm just gonna have to make sure I keep that in mind. And the big thing is I need to move the entire thing down so it actually starts at the countertop and V's up from there. So I'm gonna start over. I've got half of this laid out from the center point so that we can see what it's going to look like, and we've already decided on a couple of things. One, I don't want to have this diagonal that's created to continue all the way up into the corner. So we're actually going to take out these, and the tile is going to come down from the hood and then cross over. But we also realized that that last tile is now going to overhang the hood a little bit, or if we take it off, then the last tile is really far in. So we're going to have to figure that out. The other big thing that we saw is that there's a small gap here created at the top. And of course, you can cut small tiles to fit in those places, but we're going to see if we can modify things to get rid of that little sliver. The more little slivers that you have and small pieces you have to cut around, the more difficult it can be. It's just tedious work when you're doing an entire big wall. So we're gonna add some spacers to the entire thing, redo it a little bit, and just see how that affects the layout. I added the spacers to one side of this, and it actually fixed a couple of things I'll tell you about in just a second. But another thing I forgot to mention that would be a good thing to do is to test cut some of your tiles. You want to see how they cut, what the cut edges look like, and you can actually try a couple of different types of cutters, maybe a powered one, maybe a non-powered one, to see what kind of an edge they leave. This particular tile has some variation on the outside anyway, so having a cut edge with some variation or some chipping, you can't actually see it very much, but you want to make sure that the cuts are going to look good so that you can integrate them into the design. Now that I know that the cuts are going to work fine, let's talk about the spacers. I chose a 1/16 inch spacers, the smallest one I could find locally, and it actually worked out really well. It moved everything out just enough so that our little slice of a tile is now a square, so that'll be easier to cut and nicer looking. We do have a small little gap here, but I think we can fill that with grout or caulking and it won't be noticeable. And so I'm pretty glad that I tried with the spacers because I think it's actually going to solve this problem. Now, one thing that it didn't actually solve is the overhang from the corner of the hood, whether that piece is in or out, but it did split it down the middle. So it's actually going to be the same amount whether it's under or outside of the hood. So we're just going to go with that and let it stick out a little bit and see how it goes. I know that's a whole lot of talking about laying out tile, but it's absolutely worthwhile. And you may be tempted to skip over that step, but having the actual tile that you're going to use in your space can make a huge difference. And if it doesn't work out, you can always return them. One of the things I learned by actually having the tile here is that when you put it underneath this window, I'm going to have a little gap here. So I can either cut the trim down to add a third tile, or I'm going to have to cut the tile into a smaller sliver to fit under there. I want to know that ahead of time rather than while I'm laying the tile, because as soon as I start mixing the mortar, it's going to start drying. So you have to work pretty quickly once you start laying it. Speaking of laying tile, let's finally get to it. Now, actually setting the tile is pretty easy, and there's a million videos on YouTube about how to set tiles, so I'm not going to go through that piece by piece, but a couple more tips. Make sure that you have all of your tile, all of your mortar, your tools, everything out and ready to go before you get started, because once you start putting mortar and grout on the wall, you kind of need to move pretty quickly. Another thing is cutting tile. If you're going to be using a big tile saw that's outside, make sure that it's the right time of year. Somehow I end up doing tile work in the winter, or at least when it's cold outside, like right now. And actually this time I'm going to be using a small tile cutter that's just kind of scoring the tile and then cracks it. And you can use it on any surface. It doesn't make a mess. It's not loud. It's pretty fantastic. This video is sponsored by SimpliSafe, which is fantastic because we're big fans of SimpliSafe around here, but also this time of year, you're gonna have a lot of packages show up at your doors. You can keep an eye on those packages with their video doorbells. They've also got indoor and outdoor cameras, tons of sensors to keep track of your house, and it's easy to put together a system that works for you. You go to simplysafe.com and you figure out all the items that you need, and then they ship them to you in a box. You don't have to wait on anybody to come install it. You can do it yourself. It's very easy. It only takes about 30 minutes. Once you've got it installed, you want to sign up for their interactive monitoring. Their 24/7 interactive monitoring is now powered by Fast Protect technology, which is exclusive to SimpliSafe. Once you sign up for that, you have no contract. You can cancel at any time, but it's only about $1 a day, so it's absolutely worthwhile. They can get you the help you need if any of your sensors are tripped when your system is armed. It's a great way to protect your home and your stuff. Be sure to go check out SimpliSafe at simplysafe.com/ILTMS and get 40% off new orders. It's a fantastic deal. It's a perfect time of year to do it. Be sure to go check them out. Big thanks to SimpliSafe for sponsoring this video. And again, there's no safe like SimpliSafe. As I've been going along, I've been using a little torpedo level to make sure that all the vertical ones are plumb, all the horizontal ones are flat and level, and they were, but then I realized that they're actually beginning to sag a little bit just because there's nothing underneath them to support. So as I added a tile over here to connect it to the countertop, I realized that it was not level anymore. So I'm gonna fix that by taking a straight board and just screwing it to the wall right underneath these to give everything something to sit on. Setting this tile went really smoothly, and I honestly think it's because we spent so much time planning. Whether you're doing a complex design or just something simple, figuring it out on paper first and then laying it out in real scale and full size makes a huge difference and helps save a whole lot of time. Of course, I'm sure there's a ton of tiling tips that we did not talk about, and if you've got those tips, please share them down in the comments so we can all learn together. If you want to see where we started with this kitchen and all the different projects we've done to get here, we're going to send you right over to a playlist, but first, it's time for bloopers. Actually, I don't know how many bloopers we have for this one. I got all the items, I almost said elements. I love elements. It's worthwhile to get the actual tile that you're gonna use. Speaking of laying tile, let's finally get to it. Underneath this piece of trim.